do miss a minute or two, that's fine. We'll share the recording on our YouTube channel if you miss a minute or two. Okay, I'm sure there's other people joining us, but I also know Fatima has quite a bit she wants to say in an hour, and it is now 1 minute past 12. So I think, yes, it's being recorded. So let's just start, and then we can always have others join us. There we go. There's more joining us now. But welcome, everybody. This is our first live webinar for 2022, hosted by the DRM. Just quickly, before we start with the webinar, like we said, Fatima has a lot that she wants to share with us today. But there are some housekeeping rules, nothing too serious. But first, this presentation is being recorded, and it will be uploaded onto our CISA DRM YouTube channel for larger dissemination amongst our colleagues. And that recording will also then be shared on our LinkedIn and Facebook channels, as well as our newsletter for people who are registered with the DRM and subscribe to our newsletters. If you are worried about your privacy, just message us in the chat box if you would rather have a comment that is not linked to your name in this recording. Please don't stop the recording if you do have the ability to stop it, purely because we do want to make this opportunity available to others afterwards. Can all comments and questions also please be placed in the chat box? We will address all questions at the end, unless Ms. Peters provides time between sections for questions, but otherwise it can sometimes be a little bit overwhelming where mid-sentence you're asked a question and you completely lose your train of thought. Please switch off your camera and microphone to minimize distractions, but it looks like you've all done that already. Thank you so much. And I would also like to thank our other executives. I see Dr. Mapula online for attending and providing background support. For those unfamiliar, it sounds like Ms. Fatima Peters knows quite a few of you, but she is a lecturer at the University of Venda. She has worked in higher education for over 12 years and has received awards from the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, Dynamics of Building a Better Future, and the Technology Higher Education Network South Africa. Her research interests are research, human rights, sexuality and gender, higher education, decolonization, climate and environmental psychology. She is one of the lecturers of research methodology, community psychology and ethics, and is therefore one of the best in our fields for today's topic. Thank you so much for your time today, everybody, but a special thanks to you, Ms. Peters, for the session today.
Thank you so much, Pakiza, for that very beautiful introduction. I see Jeffrey Rink is sharing his screen. I hope you don't mind, Jeffrey, if I share my screen. Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay. Right. So thank you, everybody, for coming today or participating in this interesting webinar. It's Human Rights Month. It was Freedom Day on the 27th, and this presentation is linked to the fact that we had Human Rights Freedom Day on the 27th. So as my colleagues said, my name is Fatima Peters. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Psychology, and today's presentation is about human rights, ethics, and research. The basic outline for the presentation, I'm going to talk you through some of the international and national legal frameworks that govern human rights, and then I'm going to link this to research. I'm going to talk about the research practice, and then hopefully maybe we can have a discussion about how do we improve and update our ethical practices. Right? So that's the outline of the presentation. So I can't see the chat box, but I'd like to start with the question and maybe gauge the audience and ask you, what is the link between human rights and ethics? I'm going to go to my chat box to see if there are any comments. So the question is, what is the link between human rights and ethics? Anybody want to give it a go or try? What do you think is the link? There's no right or wrong answer. The audience in today's webinar is quite diverse, from students that are undergraduate, third year and fourth year, as well as doctors and possibly professors in the audience. So there's no right or wrong answer. The question is, what are your thoughts? Is there anyone that would like to give a try as to what is the link between human rights and ethics? Thank you, Richard. So Richard says ethics encompasses the adherence to and protection of human rights. That's very well said. Natalie, thank you. She says that it's about fairness. That's really good responses. Anyone else? Okay, thank you, Shannon. Shannon says, I think that the link between the two is that they are both about moral principles. So these suggestions and feedback is really excellent, and that definitely is the answer to the question about the link between human rights and ethics. Right? So as I said, the other day was Freedom Day, the 27th, and it marks the 18th anniversary of the 18th anniversary of South Africans having gone to the polls and voting for the first time in a nationally democratic election. And today, the 27th, really marks a culmination of people in South Africa having fought with blood, sweat, and tears for basic human rights. The human right to walk where you want, to go to where you want, to do what you want to, and these are rights that our forefathers did not have. To various extents, I remember as a child growing up, and my dad would tell us stories about my great-great-grandfather being a slave and how he wasn't allowed to do what he wanted to do, and he was forced to, if he is told by the slave owner to do something, he didn't have a choice. What he wore, what he did, his liberty, his choices, those things were not present for people that were slaves. And you know, when you grow up as a child, your parents tell you all these stories and you think, oh, honestly, talking about the past, it's not relevant. But we need to keep track of our history because history keeps repeating itself. And if I leave you with anything today, I think that it's hopefully that you take note of how history is repeating itself and how we need to take note of this. So the other story I wanted to talk about was my father would always tell us about when he and my grandfather went and they were protesting in the city of Cape Town for against the pass laws, because if you lived in the city of Cape Town, you were not allowed to walk where you want to at certain times of day. Congregating with more than one person was not allowed. If you were walking on the road, you would be stopped and asked for your passport for the police to verify that you are actually where you were supposed to be. And things such as marrying who you want to, living how you want to, intermarriages were not allowed. So there are many rights that our forefathers have fought for us in today's day and age to be able to enjoy. And fighting for those rights were not easy, but I think it is taken for granted, and it can only be taken for granted when we are able to practice the rights without infringement. So the reason why I'm mentioning this comment about freedoms is that human rights is about having the right to basic necessities such as water, electricity, sanitation, and having grown up in Cape Town, these basic human rights are not things that when I was a child was something that I had to fight for because I grew up in the city. So in the city, things such as water, sanitation, and refuse removal. These are things that I taken for granted. However, having come to Limpopo and realizing that there are children going to schools and having to use per toilets, and people without electricity, people that are struggling, I realized that, yes, coming from Cape Town and growing up in a community where you see young people being killed, young people using drugs, those are an infringement of your rights. But basic human rights, to more or less extent, in the city seems to be much more accessible than in rural communities. Okay. So for this presentation, I'd like to bring awareness to the fact that for rural communities, there are really basic human rights that we still need to address as a country. Okay. So what are the different human rights? For us as South Africans, the human rights are enshrined in the South African Constitution. The South African Constitution is the highest law in the land. And in the South African Constitution, basic human rights such as freedom, peace, equality, dignity, hope, love, education, justice, access to food, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. These are basic human rights enshrined in the South African Constitution. Now, a human right is referred to as a standard that recognizes and protects the dignity of all human beings. And if we look at South African history specifically, we find that this was not the rights that was given to all people. If you were not of a particular race which controlled the whole of South Africa, then the rest of people of color did not have basic human rights. Freedom was something that only a minority of people had in South Africa. So human rights also governs how we engage with each other as human beings, and also what we can expect from government to do for us as human beings, right? The other thing is that human rights, there's no bigger human right and smaller human right. Even though the picture has different size fonts, all human rights, all people, regardless of who we are, have equal human rights, and all human rights are equal to each other. There's no hierarchy for these human rights. But with all human rights, there is a boundary. And I'd like to refer to that boundary as, you know, when you're walking, there's this space around your body that you don't really want other people to come within. So that boundary, you have rights up until that boundary, and then you also have responsibilities. So human rights cannot function without the respect and understanding that we also have responsibilities to other people in our society, and also to make sure that we do not discriminate and infringe upon other people's rights. Okay, so this is the introduction to talk to you about human rights in South Africa. And so now I would just like to give a bit of a historical background to how human rights came about. So if you go and read the history of human rights and how the United Nations Declaration for Human Rights was established, you will come across information relating to World War II. Now, World War II took place between 1939 and 1945, and the Nazi government targeted minorities and used various inhumane and degrading practices to harm, murder, kill people that were Jewish, disabled, Romani, people that were homosexual. In current language in South Africa, we use LGBTIQ. So anybody that were homosexual, in the literature it would say homosexual, and people that were black. So anybody that was a minority became a target by the Nazi government, and these politicians used, as with apartheid, used legal precedent to murder, to kill, to practice cruel and inhumane experiments to have forced labor and slavery of people that are minorities. And this was all part of the system that the Nazi government and Hitler developed in order to oppress and subjugate people that are minorities. So if you look at historically how the Nazi government came about and how they used laws to situate people that are considered minorities in the way and to justify the abuses against minorities, the first thing that the Nazi government did, and even the apartheid government, what they did was they othered people that are different. So they used really bad research. I can't now remember the name, but eugenics. They used eugenics and said that people are inherently different by race, and so what they would do is they would say there's a superior race and an inferior race. And by doing this dichotomization through the use of labels such as race, it becomes easier then to then label the person that is a minority as inferior, to prevent them from having jobs, to not allow them to do certain, to have land, not to be part of politics. And this systematic exclusion of minorities further leads to blaming people that are othered, blaming people that are minorities for the problems that exist in society. So after World War II, all these atrocities became known. The experiments that were done to people during World War II, and what the consequences of these are for people. So the countries all came together and developed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 to address the atrocities committed by the Nazi government. So in addition to the atrocities, the Nazi government also used minority people to do research on. They experimented on Jewish people, homosexual people, black people. They experimented on them to improve how to make German troops survive better. They did research such as medical procedures and tested pharmaceuticals on people. They also had an ideology that there's a superior race and an inferior race, and they did research on people to prove this point. And so the Nazi government was really cruel, they were inhumane, and they murdered a large segment of the Jewish population. If you look at statistics, they say 2 out of 3 Jewish people were killed by the Nazi government in the places that they had occupied. Right. So after the United Nations Declaration for Human Rights was developed by the United Nations, South Africa signed it into law. And what this means is that when South Africa signs various international treaties into law, it becomes part of the legal precedent within the country. So in South Africa, we have the South African Constitution. And as I said at the beginning, the South African Constitution is the highest law in the land. And it's important that we have a legally binding document that protects the human rights of all people, regardless of who you are, where you are from, your ability, etc. Because if you look again at our history and you look at the way in which laws were implemented by the apartheid government, the politicians in parliament had the final say during the apartheid period. And what that meant was that if politicians wanted to oppress any group of people, they were able to do so because there was no external document preventing politicians from controlling people's rights and perpetuating oppression and violence against people who are then labeled as different. So in the South African Constitution, we have something called the Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights specifies all the rights of people. Now, if you look at, you have international laws and you have national law, and then all the rights and the responsibilities are then written out into other legal frameworks. And for us in psychology, the Health Professions Act 56 of 1974 is one of the national laws that not only governs what health professionals can do, but it is also a code of conduct. So the Health Professions Act serves as a standard that all psychology and other health professions need to abide by. So because we belong to SAISA, the South African Psychological Society of South Africa also has a South African Professional Conduct Guidelines in Psychology, and it was published in 2007. And if you review the Health Professions Act in relation to the South African Professional Conduct Guidelines, you will see quite a strong overlap between these two documents. Okay. Just checking my notes to make sure that I am on track. Right, so what is the importance of human rights? As I said, during the apartheid era and when you live under a autocratic government, people are not given the basic right to protest, to self-governance, to make decisions for themselves. So in the Bill of Rights, the following rights are given to all people in South Africa, regardless. So you can't be discriminated against because of race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, ethnic or social origin, color, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, conscience, belief, culture, language, and birth. So in the South African Constitution, all of these rights are enshrined, and every human being has these rights. Okay. So, what is this actual presentation about? If you look at human rights and you look at ethics and you look at research, the number one person that it is centered on is participants. Participants are the ones that experience the research method. They're the ones that we go to for information and then we leave. And one of the problems and concerns for research is that participants have human rights, and we as researchers need to protect these human rights. But how do we go about doing this? Are participants' rights seriously being protected? And are we looking beyond what it is that we are doing in the academy, in higher education? Okay, so I wanted to talk about participants' experiences of the research process. I went to Facebook and I was looking at responses by people online in relation to an article that was published in 2019 by the article is called Age and Education Related Effects of Cognitive Functioning in Colored South African Women. And this study looked at obviously cognitive decline within the population of colored women. And when you go and you review the Facebook responses of normal people to what was published about colored women and cognitive decline, you will notice a trend that people were very offended, people felt insulted, people felt sad. And what I wanted to highlight is that for us as researchers, it's not just about, okay, we must tick the box, we must have informed consent, we must have confidentiality. It's not a tick the box process for a participant who's left feeling hurt, insulted, and confused. And research is not meant to be a dirty word. If you read Smith 2012, and you will see the references at the end, she says that, you know, research is often a dirty word because participants are left feeling you came and took this information, but you give nothing back. You constantly come and take and take and take, but you give nothing back. So we as researchers, as future researchers, as academics, this is something that we need to think about more seriously in the academy. Right. We can't leave our participants strained. So, going back to our history, I have a question. Do you know what experiment the picture refers to? I want to just go to the chat box. Please don't look at my answers at the bottom. Okay. So, do you know what the picture refers to in the slide? What experiment is the picture referring to? So if you go by order, this is picture 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Do you know what experiment the picture refers to? Okay, Richard. Richard's on point today. Richard says the second picture is about Milgram. That is correct. Anyone else? Leonie says number 4 is Skinner. Richard says the third one is Zimbardo's prison experiment. Litwin says the first one is Hollow's pit of despair. Garrett says the third one is the prison experiment. So the first one is Hollow's pit of despair. The second one is definitely Milgram's experiment. The third one is Zimbardo's prison experiment. The fourth one is Watson and Araya's Little Albert experiment, and the last one is Seelman's look into learned helplessness. Now, if you are interested and you really go online and you go and read about psychological experiments and human rights violations in research and psychology, and you read these things, you are really left with a sense that my God, what are psychologists thinking? Why would you deprive a monkey and make the monkey feel a sense of hopelessness and despair by taking away the comfort? So if you look at Hollow's pit of despair, the mother was taken away from the monkey, and then the monkey was given a wire mother and a mother with a softness, as you can see in the picture. And then the monkey would go to the wire mother for nourishment, but not to the wire mother for comfort. And one of the outcomes for this experiment was that monkeys were unable to socialize, make friends, have normal sexual conduct. It was actually pretty scary that because of the way the experiment was conducted, these monkeys were then not even able to look after their own offspring. Milgram's experiment, people were asked to give electrocution, shock to people, to the highest extent. People didn't know that they were giving electroshock to an actor. But the psychological outcome for this particular experiment is that many of the participants in the end didn't or had reevaluated their lives and questioned themselves and who they were. If you look at across all of these experiments, they were really cruel and inhumane treatment of human beings and animals, and it's quite concerning that historically for us in psychology we did this type of thing. However, history is there for us to learn from and improve upon. So one of the ways in which we can, as psychology, if we look at the Health Professions Act and CIS's ethical guidelines, these guidelines are based on ethical values or principles. And these ethical values and principles are the guiding values for the development of ethical codes and standards which are enshrined in the Health Professions Act and the conduct guidelines for CISA. So if you go and read about ethical values and principles in research specifically, you will find the following: beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, integrity, people's rights to dignity, and autonomy. And if we now reflect back, we reflect back to World War II, we reflect back to the scientific experiments, and we reflect back to 2019, we see that, you know, where was the respect for people's rights and dignity when people feel that the research made them feel sad? And where is the rights and the respect for the dignity of the person? When we look at our history, the question, do no harm, how has the principle of doing no harm been practiced across the historical context? So, you know, a lot of the times, we're not judged by the good that we do, but the bad that we do. And in psychology, we really need to improve upon this. So to go through the ethical values for the students in the room that might not have come across these principles or have seen it but not necessarily used them. Beneficence is about, in research, making sure that the research benefits the broader society. So at a one-on-one level, when we are speaking to participants, they might not benefit directly from the research that we are doing. A lot of the times, a student will say, oh, we're going to go back and give them the information. But the information does not necessarily change the material circumstances of the person that we are speaking to. And so when we link beneficence to respect for people, for justice, if we link beneficence to justice, for us in psychology, looking at what it is that we are researching and how it is that we can use this information to improve the lived reality of people on the ground is what we can strive for. And something that I've noticed in the psychology discipline, researchers and people that in the South African Journal of Psychology are really addressing the problem of injustice and trying to correct some of the problems that are evident in the profession through the principle of justice. So as I said, non-malfeasance is about do no harm. And it's more than just physical, it's also psychological. If you do an experiment with somebody and you ask this person to comply with your authority to shock someone else, and that person thinks the person that they shocked has died, the psychological harm of that type of experiment is long lasting for the participant, and it's not something that the participant can just brush off. So beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, integrity. Integrity is about doing what is truthful, fair, and really living the ethical values and principles. Respect for people's rights and dignity. As researchers, we should not be going and doing research with people and infringing upon their rights and their dignity. And the last ethical principle that I've written for us for today is autonomy. And autonomy is about respecting the rights of people to self-governance and to make choices for themselves. Now, these ethical values or principles are all enshrined in the rights of participants, and also in the Health Professions Act. These are codes. Right, so voluntary participation, informed consent, confidentiality, anonymity are part of the ethical code that we as researchers need to abide by. One of the important things, protection from deception. If you look at those experiments, a lot of the times the people did not know what they were participating in. The aims and objectives of the study was not communicated to the participant. They did not know the effects that this research would have on them. So voluntary participation is about informing. Firstly, you do informed consent, right? When you do informed consent, you tell the participants about what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, why you're going to do it, how long it's going to take. And it's important that when you are engaging, ethics is often seen as something of a hassle, the last thing you think about. But for the participant, really making sure that you explain to the participant in a language that they understand what their rights are and that they are not being forced to participate is really central. Using a language that they can understand. So voluntary participation is about making sure that participants understand that they don't have to participate. They can stop at any time and that there will be no negative consequences for them if they do decide to stop. Confidentiality is about when you're doing face-to-face interviews with somebody, you're going to know who this person is. So all the private information that can identify this person in your notes, you need to make sure that when you write your research report or thesis or dissertation or publication, that this information, the private information of the person and information that can identify who this person is not communicated in the publication of your research. So thinking about who the person is, where the person works, where the person lives, the village where the research is being done. These are some of the things that need to be considered and thought through. Should we communicate where the village that the study is being conducted in? And the concern with confidentiality and letting people know where the study is done is that you do not want to, again, do no harm. You don't want to do a research study, do a publication, say it's in a particular village, and then people stigmatize this village, or you cause that people go and burn someone's house down. You know, when we speak about human rights, we speak about ethical codes and ethical principles. These things have very practical consequences. Right? Anonymity. Anonymity is generally, I think of it when you're doing a survey, you don't really know who the person is, and if you do collect student numbers or identifiable information, this information is often also kept and protected. So in order to improve confidentiality and anonymity, you could use things like a numeric identifier or an alphabetic identifier. Numeric would be participant 1, participant 2, when you're now naming your information, who the person is. Or you could use participant A, participant B, so you could use either a number or a letter. Right, and always protect your participant from deception. And the one thing I didn't write here is debrief your participants after you do the study. Talk to them about the experiences, what they have gone through, what they think about it. If your study is about sexual consent and a participant in an interview tells you that they were sexually harmed, you have a responsibility to give this person information to be able to deal with the psychological consequence of what they have gone through. So it's not enough to just go and collect information. You actually have to think about, I'm doing research with young women that experience domestic violence. What does this mean for the participant? How do I engage the participant? What do I need to do further than just ticking the box that is required from the university? How do I engage this person in a way that is respectful and humane? And I'd like to refer us all, if you have time, please go on to the CISA YouTube channel and listen to Dr. James Takalani's presentation on trustworthiness. How should we go about working in the community and using the principles of trustworthiness so that we improve our rapport with people, but also ensuring that we do no harm? Okay. So now we're getting to the more fun aspects of the presentation, where I'd like to really engage with you about research, where we are currently at, and what that means for us moving forward as researchers. So if you have training at 4th year honors master's level, you would have come or should have come across the concept of axiology. So axiology is about the researcher's values, worldviews, and ethics, and how these things really influence the research process. So go and read Lincoln 2011, where they speak about often who is the one that identifies the problem. It's the researcher or the student. Where do you get this information from? From the literature. What do you think the problem is? So the conceptualization of the problem, what is the gap in the literature? These things are all decided by the researcher. And so when you think about what is our ethical responsibility to participants, we have to ask a different set of questions, such as how is the methodology experienced by participants? Who has power? Who is speaking on behalf of whom? And whose voice is being represented in the literature? Now, again, if you go and read Chilisa and Smith 2012, they speak about how knowledge is often situated within a global north way of thinking about what knowledge is, how is knowledge developed, what is the nature of reality. And this information becomes overarching and everyone else is expected to fit into this information. And what psychology is doing currently is questioning whose knowledge is being represented, why is that knowledge being represented, how can we do research differently to be more respectful and empowering of our participants. And so what is really been beautiful to see for me as a researcher is the increased developments of new research methods such as participatory action research. I know it's not new, but there's a lot more of it being done. There's a more openness to doing research methods that are different, that are respectful, that looks to collaborate with participants as opposed to the traditional, I go, I do an interview. If we look at the interview as a research method, the researcher still dictates what the question are, how it is addressed, what the conversation is. And so for us as researchers, really critically thinking about what the method is, how we use the method, how the method is experienced, and developing new methods is what is being done currently. Other research methods that are beautiful to see are things such as a critical approach, an emancipatory approach, increased empowerment of participants and expressing their voices. There's a decolonial turn where there's an understanding that people from the global south have experienced multiple systemic forms of oppression, and their voices needs to be heard in order for us to address the problems that are experienced. And majority of the time, the participants in our country and across the world are often marginalized people. So realizing and understanding how poverty, race, our intersectional positions affect our participants is part of the decolonial turn, and looking towards how we can really listen to the voices of our participants. There's an increased use of qualitative research methods, and the point I want to make about this is that often when we reflect back at the university and ethical procedures, the rules that we have to follow often do not take into account really sitting and listening to a participant and their lived experiences and using methods differently to the traditional global northern way of doing research. There's an increased use of photo voice, autoethnography, narrative and discursive approaches, and life histories. And I don't know, for me, it's just interesting to read about these different methods and think about how we can really use these methods and make a difference in participants' lives and definitely in the research field. So as I said, most of the research is done on marginalized people. We collect information from them, but we really need to reflect on the methods and evaluate how power influences the research encounter. And the question is, are we doing research to acknowledge the lived reality and worldviews of people from the global south, or are we just continuing as usual? So to end off the presentation, I've kept to the time limit. It's now 1:45, and I have a question. What are your thoughts about how we as researchers can address the needs of participants using a decolonial framework? Thinking about the lived reality of people. And remember, there's no right or wrong answers. I've got a few thoughts. but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the matter. What are your thoughts about how we as researchers can change and adjust? What do we need in order to change? What are your thoughts about this? Anyone want to give it a go? Right, so I was reading an article by Lipscomb, and she was talking about positionality and how it is that we need to acknowledge where we have come from and how this influences what we are doing. Now, if you read about positionality and reflexivity, this is a process that we as researchers should engage in, and it's something that we should think about from the first day that we're actually doing the research. So Lipscomb says that when we actually, sorry about that, when we are doing research and we are applying for ethical clearance, our ethical protocols need to adjust to the fact that we can't just say we're not going to do research with vulnerable people, because by saying that we're then excluding their voices. And when you think about that and you reflect back on feminism, for example, how was research conducted on women's experiences of menstruation and the participants are male? So if women are considered vulnerable, they're not included as participants, and as a result, you don't really get to understand women's lived experiences because the participants are not relevant to the question being asked. So some of the things that I've come across in the literature is that we should question ourselves, think about what we are doing and how we are doing it. Richard, I see you gave a beautiful response. You say, I think change has to start at an undergraduate level where varied methods of research and decolonial methods are taught to students, and perhaps even get students at an undergraduate level to have opportunities to participate in research projects that are more decolonial in scope. That would be really excellent, and I think as we are engaging on this platform, we really should be encouraging change within various departments to do what Richard is suggesting. Not only changing teaching curriculum, but also engaging students in research practice and research projects. Really good suggestion, Richard. Is there any other suggestions? Okay, so as I was saying, one of the things is positionality. Where are you from? Dr. Makuda, you have your hand up. Would you like to give a contribution?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Peters. Thank you, Ms. Peters, for the wonderful presentation. So my input goes to the fact that as you now touch on, considering decolonial aspect of research, combining that with ethics, I've seen and observed when we do inter-country or multi-country studies that, there are so many things that needs to be considered in the context of, the place where research is done. Obviously, when you do multi-country research, there are standard procedures and protocols that are uniform for all the countries. But at the end of the day, I think it's so important to consider, ethics from, a decolonial perspective. And I've seen, so as you touched upon, vulnerable groups, usually like if you now apply for IRB in the US to do research with children, it's so difficult because they are quite sensitive with that. But at the same time, as you were saying, then it silences their voices. So that limits the knowledge that we have from their end. And With that as well, I also think, I was just thinking aloud to say, even when we say we are obtaining, consent from their parents and assent from them, most times what I've seen is that it's overridden by parents, because once parents agrees, the children are automatically, told. And usually if we are coming from a school perspective where we're doing research in the schools, the parents will have the meeting and then they will sign those consent to say they're giving the consent. And once that occurs, you find that the child is, it's like, although they still have a chance, they still have an opportunity to refuse to partake. But from a cultural perspective, once your parent says, do this, you cannot say no to that. So I was just bringing the two ends of the coin to say, on one hand, we really want to hear from these vulnerable groups. And I think it's important to be contextual, to consider contextual issues, to ensure that ethics are really adhered to, because it's quite important to make sure these people understand. And I think from a wide range of experience with community work and community research, some, when you go to communities, they don't even know, they have never had a research experience where researchers comes to their community. So if it's the first time, it's upon the shoulders of the researcher to make sure that we explain it explicitly and in simple language, that people don't feel coerced, or they don't feel like if they don't partake, then it will be perceived somehow that this is 100% voluntarily, and they should, make that decision. So, and it's quite interesting how you have unpacked, how these aspects interlinked with each other. So, quite a wonderful presentation, Miss Peter. So, thank you. So, that was my input.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mapura. And I really agree. When you do research with children, often their voices are not heard. And if you look at international instruments, the United Nations Conventions for the Rights of the Child, internationally, the Children's Act for Children in South Africa, we really enshrine and give children the right, many rights. But on a cultural perspective, as Dr. Mapura is saying, it's very seldom that we actually listen well to children and what they want and what they desire. So Leonie is also given a lovely input. There are also ethical considerations and consequences for participants in terms of the application, use, publication of findings. We have a responsibility to share findings responsibly. So this is, what she's referring to is member checking, I think. And when we go back to participants and give them the information that they had given to us, we have a responsibility to make sure that we represent their voices fairly and ethically, and make sure that we actually do not increase the harm to them. So building the ethical principles and ethical codes into our practice from day one, thinking about being more careful with the lived reality of our participants is necessary. Richard says it would be great to have more open access journals, which I think would encourage further innovation and research outside of traditional journals. I agree with you, Richard, that open access journals is really the way to go. Paying for knowledge is really a way of excluding and keeping people, mainly from Africa, out of the knowledge development area. So I agree. I must say, over the past few years, for me as a person in academia, having access to all these webinars, having CISA main office do all their presentations, it really opens up and helps us to engage more about the things that is important to us. So really interesting and good comment there. So it's 5-1. Are there any questions? Something that you would like clarification on? Leonie says the recorded body of knowledge in psychology and in any one language, whether that languages English or Zulu, Mandarin or French or any other language is a fraction of the entire body of knowledge. I believe psychology will only come into its own if it's underpinned by an integrated global body of knowledge. Really, thank you for that input, Leonie. Is there any questions? I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Are there any questions? Any additional comments?
While some of our guests are still coming up with their final comments, thank you so much again, Fatima. This was really a very useful webinar. Well done.
Dr. Mapura has a last comment. We are also in an era where funders do control what is published, and this at times is not totally a full representation of what is found. Reporting findings responsibly sometimes has its limitations. I completely agree. The people with the money are mainly from the global north, and we are in the global south are oftentimes at the mercy. So for those that are working in these research teams, I think being empowered to really engage the funders to maybe see things differently is necessary for us. And also to train our students to not just accept methods as they are, to really engage methods and think more critically about it. Thank you everybody for the lovely comments in the chat box. It's appreciated. Right. I've got nothing else. I think Pakiza, we can wrap up and close the session if it's okay with you.
Thank you everybody for attending. Thank you again, Fatima, for presenting. I think we all have something to think about for the rest of the afternoon. If you haven't already, could you please evaluate the webinar? At the end, we also ask, is there anything else you would like to see us presenting on? So please, please share your comments with us. Thank you again for making time for us this afternoon. I've reshared the link and enjoy your afternoon, everybody.
Bye.